The whole world is watching you, and your idea of political reform are expired. Your exercise of political reform expired, and your time is running out. And the second message to all Jordanian people and Jordanians movement, we are always behind you, telling you till you to receive your freedom. The third message to the American people, stand by Jordanian people and be part of an event that will change the course of history. Today we discuss and we will use expertise to guide these discussions between Mr. ستيفن and Dr. Abdussalam Mualla and Mr. Adnan Atiyat and Mr. Naif Touara. We start with Mr. ستيفن. He is expert in the Arab Spring, and we have to take the case of Jordan. Thank you, please, Mr. ستيفن.
Okay, thanks very much, and thanks for putting this together, and thanks for inviting me. I'll just comment a little bit on some of the observations that I have over the past year. As you all know, the past year has been quite an eventful one in the Middle East and North Africa. The organization that I work for, the Project on Middle East Democracy, focuses on political reform, transition to democracy across the Arab world, as well as in Iran and Turkey. And while Jordan has not been shaken by the Arab Spring to the degree that some of the other countries have, not in the way that Tunisia or Egypt or Libya or Yemen or Bahrain or Syria have, nonetheless, I think there has been a significant impact of the Arab Spring, the uprisings in Jordan, both an impact of rising kind of discontent and protests in Jordan that mirror what we've seen in some of the other countries. And then there's also a potential very strong impact for destabilization of Jordan by some of the protests in some of the neighboring countries, particularly Syria. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of what we've seen in the past year. Although Jordan's gotten quite a bit less attention than some of the other countries that I mentioned, it should be noted, I mean, there have been protests in Jordan essentially just about every week since they began on the 14th of January 2011, which was the same day that President Ben Ali was forced from power in Tunisia. Just about every Friday since then, we've seen protests continuing in Jordan. And these protests have certainly been on a larger scale than anything Jordan had seen before the past year. And protesters gradually over the course of the past year have become emboldened. And I think that there are signs that many within the government, within the regime, within the monarchy, have been somewhat taken aback and surprised by the degree of opposition and the degree of criticism that's been expressed in these protests over the past year. Many of the factors that we have seen lead to dramatic change in other Arab countries, such as Tunisia or Egypt, seem to also be present very much in Jordan. There are significant economic pressures, including high and rising unemployment, a dramatic increase of government revenues, particularly caused by the significant increase in oil prices. And the Jordanian government during this time has increased the amount of spending dramatically on oil and gas subsidies in order to keep gas prices stable. The last time that they allowed gas prices to increase by cutting subsidies in 2008, and they felt as though that sparked increased dissent and animosity toward the regime, and they seem unwilling to do that. And just a few weeks ago, they confirmed that they're going to, at least for the time being, maintain subsidies despite the exorbitant cost and rising costs. Jordan has also seen sort of a steadily increasing perceptions of corruption within the royal family, particularly targeted at Queen Rania and her family. And to many, this is reminiscent of the anger that we saw about corruption in Tunisia directed toward Leila Tarabulsi, the wife of Ben Ali. This criticism has sort of steadily increased, and what used to sort of be a taboo of criticism of the royal family seems to be no longer so forbidden, seems to be more accepted in the public discourse. Just a couple of weeks ago, at the beginning of this month, there was a letter that was written, signed by 36 Bedouin leaders of different tribes in Jordan that was directly accusing Queen Rani and her family of corruption. And it was a very strongly worded letter that also, had hinted that if serious reforms were not undertaken and serious measures taken to address issues of corruption, that Jordan would likely suffer the fate of Tunisia and Egypt before it. So it was quite an unusual public dissent coming from sort of the what's known as sort of the East Bankers, the tribes that are the kind of Bedouin tribes of Jordan, as opposed to the Palestinian Jordanian population. And that's something else that we've seen over the past years, a broadening of criticism and opposition to new parts of the Jordanian populace, including parts geographically, including parts in the south that have long been very loyal to the king and the royal family. There's been a lot of discontent with what has been seen by some of the East Bakers and by some of the tribes as the increasing power of the Palestinians. At the same time, a lot of the Palestinian population is still unhappy with what it sees as some of the status quo. So I think that the monarchy is increasingly facing criticism, from all sides. Direct criticism of the royal family, and particularly Queen Rani, has increased considerably in the public discourse. Direct criticism of the king is still relatively rare, and that has still not been tolerated by the government. There have been a number of cases in recent weeks. There have been a few cases of young protesters that have been sentenced to 2 years in prison for insulting or defaming the king. There's one case where there was an 18-year-old protester in Amman that burned a picture of the king, and he's been sentenced to 2 years in prison. And according to numerous human rights organizations, it appears that he was sentenced in a military court, and it seems that he also may have been beaten and tortured during his, after following his arrest. So that's cause for concern, and to some, these sort of strong sentences given to youth for criticizing the king are perceived in some circles as sort of signs of weakness of the monarchy. If the monarchy can't tolerate 18-year-olds shouting against the king, then maybe it kind of reveals some anxiety within the monarchy that would not have been the case in the past. In terms of the response that we've seen from the king and the monarchy and the government, it's been very much along the lines of what we've seen many times in the past in Jordan. We've seen, since these protests began in January 2011, we've seen 2 cabinet reshuffles with 2 new prime ministers appointed. This is nothing new in Jordan. In the last 50 years, I think Jordan has had, I think we're now in the 61st prime minister. For the standard response from King Abdullah and his father before him to pressure has been to deflect the pressure away from the monarchy and toward the government, and toward the cabinet, and the prime minister that, of course, is selected by the monarchy, and to replace. And so when there's discontent, the target of that discontent, for the most part, over most of the past year, the target of the protest and the chants in the streets in Jordan has been more the government than the regime or the king, and that's somewhat different from some of the other countries in the region, where the calls were for the fall of the regime. Of course, most of the countries that have seen widespread protests have not been monarchies. That were sort of republics with so-called elected presidents in place, and those presidents were normally the main focus of the protest. The only other monarchy that's had really widespread protests in the past year is Bahrain, and there again the target of the protest has been very much King Hamad himself. In Jordan, the protests have not focused as much directly on the king, with sort of occasional and maybe more frequent exceptions in the last couple of months. And King Abdullah has sort of responded by both replacing his cabinet twice in the past year, and then also was proposing some constitutional amendments and offering some so-called reforms. It seems, on the surface that, I would also add there's also been a couple of high-profile cases where high-profile individuals had charges of corruption brought against them to sort of try to address the rising public concern with corruption. On the surface, well, it does seem that there has been some surprise in these cases of corruption that were brought. One of those that was charged with corruption just a few weeks ago was Mohammed Dahabi, who was the former head of the Jordanian intelligence, and so many were surprised to see someone that was a legitimate kind of regime insider and had been very high-ranking and very influential be brought on charges of corruption. On the other hand, the actions taken so far by the governments and the regime seem to be viewed with skepticism. It should be noted that the skepticism, I think, is warranted given Jordan's trajectory over the past couple of decades. I would note that as of 1992, Jordan had, according to Freedom House, which ranks countries worldwide in terms of political rights and civil liberties, as of 1992, Jordan was scored by Freedom House as it received sort of the freest scores that any Arab country has ever received. Their scale goes from 1 to 7, with 1 being the freest and 7 being the most oppressive, the least free. In 1992, Jordan received a score of 3 for political rights and 3 for civil liberties. By last year, those scores had deteriorated to a 5 for civil liberties and a 6 for political rights. So Jordan, over the last 20 years, has gone from being the freest, most liberal Arab country politically to among the world's more repressive regimes. And so I think that the kind of trajectory has happened also amid lots of promises, public promises of reform. In the past decade, King Abdullah has announced 3 major reform initiatives: the Jordan First Initiative in 2002, the National Agenda in 2005, and the We Are All Jordan initiative in 2006. And none of these announced so-called major reform initiatives have really led to any fundamental political reform. We've not seen any of the sort of, addressing the kind of fundamental imbalance of power between the monarchy and, elected bodies, including the parliament. The monarchy and the royal court and the, monarchy-appointed prime minister seem to have all of the power, and, elected bodies such as the parliament seem to be, are extremely weak, have very limited power, and there's also, lots of concerns about the fairness of the electoral law. So far we've seen, in some sense, a slightly larger version of what we've seen in the past. In response to a much larger protest, we've seen, a sort of larger pronouncements of reform than in the past, but still rather modest steps. We've seen a new proposed electoral law that would replace the widely criticized one-vote system with a 2-tier proportional list system, but that law has not yet been put in place, and that law also still does not address some of the major concerns regarding gerrymandering and the sort of overrepresentation of rural parts of the country at the expense of the urban centers in Amman and Zarqa. I think so far, I think there's a lot of disappointment, and I think we would have to say that there is, there's certainly a real possibility of further instability in Jordan if there's not a real serious reform effort undertaken, considerably more than we've seen so far. One last note I would add is that I think the events in Syria also very much could threaten to destabilize things in Jordan. The political opposition in Jordan up until now, has, as has been the case in many other Arab countries, including Syria, the political opposition has been quite fractured, and we've seen different responses to the events in Syria, on Jordan's northern border, with many of particularly a lot of the Islamist opposition, including the Islamist Action Front, have been supportive of the protests in Syria and have called for Assad to be overthrown. And King Abdullah was the first Arab leader in the neighboring states of Syria to essentially say that Assad should step down, which he said for the first time in November.